think everyone is, even though you can't see them, everyone is very excited to listen to you. And for the questions, I'll be here, and if you can't hear the questions, I'll just ask you. Okay?
So we're ready to roll. Okay. Thank you very much. We starting? Yep. I'm very sorry not to be there. It's my teaching schedule made it impossible, and last week of term I've got 90 students chasing me, and I just got away to talk to you this morning. I'm going to talk about both the challenges of measurement and the challenges of policy today. I can't see you. Moving on, can we turn the slide? I can't actually see the slide. That's a bit better. Yeah, that's great. Yep, that's great. So I'm going to review first the received wisdom. This is, wow.
Hi, Martin. Can you see us?
Are you back?
You're back.
Yes, I can.
No, it's random.
Okay. Maybe, Ander, can you switch to slide 5?
Yeah. Is it this one?
Okay. No, that's, no, before 5.
We good.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
The number on the bottom right corner. Okay, received wisdom. This is a picture from Francois Bourguignon's book on globalization and inequality, just tracking inequality measures starting around 1990. Many people talk to in public don't believe that top line will be falling, precipitously so, since around the beginning of the new millennium, around 2000. But they understand a bit better when you point out that it's being driven by inequality between countries. As you can see, that next line down, inequality within countries has been drifting upwards. There's another popular view that it's drifting upwards everywhere, and that's not true. Among developing countries, it's increasing about half the time, decreasing about half the time, and not really correlated much rate with economic growth. So we're not seeing typically rising. In growing developing countries, we're seeing inequality rise about half the time, fall about half the time. But the countries where it is rising are some of the biggest, of course. China, where it's only recently stabilized, was on a long-run rising trajectory for quite a while, since about the mid-1980s. Inequality was, with poverty falling, of course. I'll give you another example, although I'm going to focus on kind of global picture. If you turn to the 2 slides later, slide 7 under. I'm also going to give you some case study sorts for Indonesia. I picked Indonesia partly because I'm working there a bit. I'm going there very soon. But here we're seeing, this is really Indonesia for a long time, not recently. I always thought of Indonesia as this sort of a great example of stable inequality, fairly rapid poverty reduction through economic growth. That's really changed in the new millennium. We're seeing inequality tracking upwards in Indonesia, and that's quite an alarming thing in Indonesia. I've been talking to politicians about this at the highest levels, and there are concerns. Again, I think there could be forces for stabilization as well, but not clear at all, certainly not as clear as in the case of China. That trend increase is going to make Indonesia as poor, unequal as Brazil in about 10 years' time. Again, I really don't think it will continue. But with inequality and inequality tracking upwards in developing countries, but certainly not all. Roughly half of growing developing countries seeing rising inequality. Okay, I'm going to try and unpack that received wisdom. 2 slides forward, point to a number of issues that have particular salience in my view, because I don't think most people actually agree with that received wisdom. It's certainly a popular view amongst economists, but as I talk to non-economists and I interact with civil society groups and NGOs working in the field, or my own observations in the field, things just don't add up. You know, there are a number of things that are missing, I think, from our received wisdom. I'm going to talk about all 3 of those: absolute inequality, the focus on the poorest, from a lot of our dialogue on inequality, and I really do mean the poorest, I'm not just talking about poverty. And thirdly, the role of national income in this whole story, and the salience that nationality can have to many people. That's something I think we have to look at in a cautious way. If we move on, slide 11 we want. That's right. You can turn it over again, get the whole slide there. Press the enter again. Okay. On absolute equality, this is what we're learning. This is something that Frank Howell looked at many years ago, and Miel, and surveys of students, almost solely students. But what we're learning, it seems, is that more than half, maybe, the majority of people don't think about inequality as relative, they think about it as absolute. This is essentially a debate for 2 axioms of inequality measurement. And it's not that one's right or one's wrong, there's 2 different views you can take. If you look at that state A and state B in the middle of the slide, 1, 2, 3, state A, and state B, 2, 4, 6. I've asked 450 students, my students, and I've done a Twitter survey on this. The majority of people, not a huge majority, but over 50%, let's say half, think that inequality is higher in state B than state A. Well, it's one of the core axioms of applied inequality measurement. I emphasize applied because theorists have understood this for a long time. Applied work using things like the usual standard Gini index would always say that inequality is the same in state A and state B. That's the scale independence axiom. The alternative axiom to that, translation invariance, says that inequality is higher in state B. Or the difference is striking. I'm also going to talk about some other concerns about standard inequality axioms in a moment. But if we move on, next slide. The reason this is so relevant, I think, is the politics underlying responses to inequality, attempts to redress inequality, or attempts to placate prejudice. The recent events in Paris on May 68 is the Grenelle Agreement. In response to that, made a 13% increase in wages. That was the proposal from the Grenelle Agreement. And many felt that this was inequitable. In other words, in the response to the Grenelle Agreement, many people felt that a constant percentage increase for everybody was inequitable because the gains, the absolute gains, would be so much larger for the rich than the poor, very obviously, and very much larger depending on the extent of initial inequality. Again, I emphasize, move on, please, that slide 13. Again, I emphasize this isn't one of these things. Slide 15, please. You were on the right slide. Back one. Sorry. Back another. That stopped. Great. What I'm showing you here the first row is the standard Gini index, the relative Gini index, the scale independent Gini index multiplied or in income by constant inequality doesn't change. That's showing you that small decrease over time. This is all. I use the Chris Lackler and Branko Milanovic put together, but I get very similar figures from my data. It's not much difference. But I've also given you the absolute Gini index. Here, you don't normalize by the current mean, you normalize by a reference mean that's fixed. Not such that they're the same in 1972. Just to show you how much larger the increase in how large the increase in global inequality is in the index. And that's not at all surprising because of that huge growth that we've seen, particularly since 2000. But in terms of magnitudes, it's dramatic. The difference between a small decrease in relative inequality versus a large increase in absolute inequality. Now, if you turn to the next slide, here I've shown you that what I mentioned before, that amongst growing economies, relative inequality is increasing about half the time and decreasing about half the time. There's a very small positive correlation. It's become slightly more positive over time, but by and large, it's still roughly true that in terms of relative inequality, economic growth in developing countries is distribution neutral. Now look at the picture on the right. That's absolute inequality. Not surprising, of course, if you've been paying attention, and this is not at all surprising. The absolute inequality index is rising sharply with overall growth rates in the mean. Next slide. Another issue here is the transfer axiom. I never thought this was really particularly contentious. I've always thought I've written about absolute inequality back 20 years ago, but I always thought mean preserving transfers from the rich to the poor reduce inequality, roughly speaking. Okay, and again, it seems sensible. However, in both my students and those Twitter surveys that I've been doing, people, a minority, not the majority, but a pretty sizable minority, think that the distribution 2, 5, 5, 10 is more unequal than 2, 4, 6, 10. Now, that violates the transfer axiom. But it's not that people, when I also ask them, they agree, almost everybody agrees that 2, 4, 6 is more unequal than 3, 4, 5. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about concerns about the extremes of distribution. People look at distributions and they look at the very bottom and they look at the very top and they see how they're doing relative to the middle. So in that 2, 5, 5, 10 distribution, I believe, and this is coming out with discussions with my students, people, they look at that and they see the richest guy has got double the next poorest guy. It's a relatively more than was got this redistribution in the middle. It doesn't give them much cause for concern. It's rather how the extremes are doing relative to the middle. Focus. We've got a lot of discussion recently. High end. Next slide, please. The high end of inequality. I want to just, and that's all entirely justified in my view, and it's important, and I think there are a lot of reasons to be worried about it, and I'm going to come back to those. But I want to focus on something that's getting hot attention, the distribution of living standards. How is that doing relative to the mean, relative to the top? Here we see really conflicting views. I've given you a quote here from Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. We need to reach out and lift the lifeboat. A similar comment from Guy Ryder, and similar comments from places like the Vatican. Yet what economists are saying, very different things. All rising tide lifts all boat, growth, all boats. Growth is good for the poor. Breakthrough from the bottom. appear to be saying something very different. When I look at Ban Ki-moon's comment, my first reaction when I heard that some years back, how's it possible? Hasn't he read my papers? Doesn't he know that substantially in the developing world? And then I started to think, well, maybe there's something missing here. Is this very porous? And you see that so much. If you look at this picture on the left, they're showing you two distributions, maybe before and after some policy change or over time. And on similarly, two distributions on the right. Both of these, we have poverty is unambiguously fallen. I've drawn a poverty line there, same change in the poverty index. But look, the real difference is in what's happening at the very bottom of the distribution. If you click over one more time, enter, the one on the left, the floor stayed put. The one on the right, the floor has risen. That difference is missing from all of our standard measures. There's some weight attached to what's happening at the bottom, but it doesn't directly tell us what's happening at the very bottom of the distribution. That's actually quite hard to measure, and surveys are not well designed for this purpose. They're not intended for measuring what's happening at the bottom. You've got to do some careful averaging. Some validation has been a research project of mine for a while now, and I've got some students working on it too. But here's a very simple take on it. Let's look at if you see that the smaller graph in the middle there, that's showing you over this 30-year period, it's showing you the cumulative distribution of the gain. We see this first order dominance. But look, we don't see anything happening at the bottom. The absolute gains at the bottom are virtually zero, and they rise through percentiles of distribution. Turning to the next picture, next slide. This is Branko's, I don't know if Branko's there, but Branko Milanovic's famous elephant graph. And this is very interesting. It got a lot of justified attention, showing proportionate changes, the growth incidence curve, kind of a global growth incidence curve, showing percentage changes in real income by percentiles of the distribution for a roughly similar period to my last graph. What I've also shown you there is the absolute growth incidence curve. The relative growth incidence curve, the blue curve, is showing what we've learned. Small gains give us the very bottom, but I'll give it to you. Rich world, poor and middle class. Sorry, go back. I'm still looking at slide 20. Yeah, that the poor and lower middle class of the rich world, and then of course we see the elephant's trunk, the rising, the substantial gains at the very top. We turn it into the absolute growth index curve, the red curve. It's the changes at the very top are completely dominant. The gains we're seeing are very small across a large segment. In absolute terms, a large segment of the distribution. Again, now we're at slide 21. Just turn over one. Yeah. Here's another way of looking at it. Although we've made, as I've said, enormous progress in reducing numbers of people who are poor by standard poverty lines, used for the poverty lines found in lower middle income countries, all suggest that. Well, where's that progress? And here I've given you the consumption floor, my estimate of the consumption floor over time. This is an update of estimates I did in a Journal of Economic Growth paper a few years ago. And I've given you the overall mean. So look at the top one, overall mean, the blue line. Here, from 2000, we're seeing that new trajectory, as I've talked about, fantastic new growth rates, a doubling of the average growth rate in the developing world. Fantastic. Look at the floor. It hasn't pulled up the floor. No sign. The new millennium growth rates have lifted the very bottom of the distribution. So looking at that, if you look at counts of numbers of poor people in the world, we're certainly on track to eliminate poverty by 2030. 30, but that's not going to happen unless the floor rises to the poverty line. That floor has got to be lifted. In fact, it's going to take another 200 years to eliminate global poverty unless we make progress in reaching the very poorest. The case of Indonesia is kind of interesting here. Indonesia's made a bit more progress in raising the consumption floor. I've given you a similar picture here for Indonesia, but still, it's disappointing. Indonesia is one of the more successful countries against poverty and is making some more progress in raising the floor than the average for the developing world, but not much difference. If we go to the next slide, skip 2. What I'm going to talk about next is the third issue. How do we deal with differences between countries in national income? This is kind of missing. It's there implicitly, but only insofar as it affects the income of an individual. So to the extent that living in a richer country raises your consumption or income, that's reflected in our inequality measures. But there are all kinds of other arguments you can make, and one of those is relative deprivation, arguments going back to Runciman, Davis, Duesenberry, even 1949. People care about relative position in society. And one obvious dimension of that, not the only one, is how they're doing relative to the mean in society as a whole. All of that would suggest that the mean, the mean of the country you live in does matter to your welfare, and negatively, at a given own income, higher mean income of your country is going to reduce your welfare. I think there's some truth in that, but I don't think it applies when we talk about global inequality and global poverty. In fact, I think the opposite. And this is quite striking. If you think about it, living in a rich country brings all kinds of benefits that aren't plausibly reflected in the way we measure income from household surveys. There are 2 issues here. One is the measurement problem. We're measuring income over a relatively short time period. We would like to measure welfare over a longer time period than that. Current income is also missing many things. Missing access to non-market goods, incomes in kind, particularly from public sector, but not only public sector sometimes. We do quite a decent job in picking up consumption from own production. So that's really underrepresented. We also know that richer countries have better public services. We also know that they have less prone to costly forms of insecurity, civil conflict. There are all kinds of ways in which it's obviously the same income, the same household income per capita, you're going to be better off in a richer country. And that's missing from all of these calculations. So let's put it in there. What it's going to mean is that there's more than we think because it's between countries. If you move on to the next slide, I'm summarizing it. It's only about the simplest way, just because I wanted to test sensitivity of these global inequality measures to allowing for either a negative or a positive effect of national income and own welfare. So what I'm doing here is adding that parameter alpha times log mean, national mean, to the measure of income I use for measuring global inequality. Turning to the next slide. This is what it looks like between 1993 and 2012. So strikingly, we're still seeing falling global inequality for all ratings. Pretty strong result. Only if you really put a high weight on relative deprivation. Relative deprivation. Can you put it back where it was? I can't see it now. Oh, no, not the slides. The slides are fine. It's the picture graph. Yeah, it's fine. It was fine before for me.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Okay, just now. That's good. That's great. So if you look at that on the far left, the alpha equals -1. That's a purely relative deprivation view. That's saying that I think of individual welfare as your own income relative to the mean of the country you live in. In that case, well, obviously that completely wipes out the between-country component of global inequality. The mean of the ratio of the mean individual income to the mean is, of course, unity in all countries. So that just disappears, and all we're looking at there is the rising within-country component of global inequality. But as you move to less negative or more positive alphas, you see this marked divergence. That gap between those two curves for the MLD, the mean log deviation, that gap is absolutely huge. Welfare data, I anchor alpha at about 0.5. That's my current preferred point estimate, global subjective welfare data. That suggests that we're not just underestimating the extent of global inequality. The difference actually swamps all the things we've been worried about. Underreporting of incomes of the rich, for example. If your true incomes of the top 1% are doubled, that will add about 0.1 to the global MLD. What we're talking about here is for the differences in average income between countries and how they affect welfare. We're talking about a vastly larger impact on the measure of global inequality than will be attributed to even substantial position being the rich. Next comment, next slide. Actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to be very quick here, but I also want to say something about how we're doing all of this. I've given you a quick summary. Next slide, please, of what we see on measurement issues, and I've also emphasized the challenges there, and I think we have to bring measurement practice in closer alignment, or at least with greater sensitivity of public perceptions of inequality, and bring in some obvious issues there. It's not like it's all pointing in the same direction either. One way we can see rising global inequality, another way we can see falling global inequality, but we've got to be very precise about what we even mean by global inequality to get anywhere in these debates. I want to just say a few words about the policy side. Here I want to emphasize that there are really two challenges ahead, a motivational challenge and a policy challenge. The motivational challenge, we succeeded over some decades, we succeeded in getting a global consensus on poverty. And I think there's nobody today who's going to say, at least in public, that we eliminate extreme absolute poverty. Motivational challenge is much greater for inequality. We do not have anything like a consensus. I want to review why that's the case. I did an op-ed in Le Monde last year, which talked about how this issue, but there's much more we could say. And then I said a little bit about the policy challenge. And very brief. Next slide, please. This emphasizes two things. I want to keep emphasis on the ethical arguments because I do think they have salience for people. If we're going to motivate action, motivate at least a better public discourse, the ethics in mind because it is important. But I think here we've also got to unpack this word inequality. It's dangerously big, and it also fuels reactions that aren't very helpful. I'm reminded of when Barack Obama invited a bunch of people to the Oval Office to us, and he asked them, experts on poverty and inequality in the United States. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. And this group of people was, how do I talk about inequality in America without being accused of class warfare? Well, my answer would be to unpack it a bit. Think about the specific aspects of inequality that matter. And I think unequal opportunities in life is something around which there can be considerable sad. And certainly what's happening to the poorest, obviously issues like discrimination and specific inequality. Good argument for believing that inequality shouldn't go to zero. Of course, that doesn't mean that that doesn't excuse very high inequality, which can have huge ethical and other economic costs. But specific inequalities, ethnicity, gender, geographic inequalities, arguably should go to zero. There, I think there's a salience to inequality that we need to bring in very fully. And I don't think it's properly captured in the decompositions we do, as people like Ravi Kamper have emphasized. We go to the next slide. So on costs, I think there's an emerging consensus. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming at all, but I think the bulk of evidence and theory is pointing in this direction. We used to think that inequality is good for growth. We now think it's probably bad for growth, or it's neutral. A bunch of studies, a bunch of theoretical arguments going back 30, 40 years that are getting a lot more traction empirically. Countries starting out with high inequality have a harder time growing their economy and a harder time assuring that the growth is pro-poor. Next slide. This is, I can probably next slide too. I'm really worried about time here. Okay, I've just listed, I'm not going to go through this, listed the things that I think remain crucial on the policy agenda, but there are a couple of more subtle points. If you go to the next slide.
Like 1 or 2 minutes, not more than that.
It's also worrying in the near term, even though they're good for poverty reduction. I don't think that trade-off entirely goes away. It's overestimated. I'll give you one example here. The schooling gaps between the rich and the poor. I've given you here the gap between the schooling attainments completed 6, 15 to 19-year-old kids across countries. The gap in attainment between the top quintile and the bottom quintile plotted against mean school enrollment. And the point is that it increases initially. For about the gap attainment increases as average attainments rises. What does that mean? Well, we know that log earnings are linear in schooling, the famous Minserian model. We know that that's going to mean that generalized increases in education expansion are going to be income inequality increasing initially. After a while, they'll fall, a kind of Kuznets curve. It's actually one of the few Kuznets curves I've seen that actually does hold water empirically, at least as far as I've been able to determine. So implication of that is that a lot of effort here is going to, can you go back to the slide? Yeah, we're talking about this slide. A lot of effort here is going to have to go into getting schooling into poor kids, getting schooling to kids of poor families. Generalized expansions, particularly in low-income countries, are going to come with an inequality cost, or you're going to have to live with that cost for a while. I prefer the former approach. Move on, please. Let's see. Another thing is OECD, generally rich countries, we certainly learned that fiscal redistribution can work substantially. I mean, the average Gini of marketing incomes in the OECD is 0.49. Developing countries, the performance is pretty poor in the developing world. If you go to the next slide. This is, or maybe go to the next slide. I think I won't have time.
Martin, if you could just maybe
Try one more.
we can take 5
One more,
minutes
please.
for questions.
This summarizes it, so just stay there for a moment. Here I've given you a picture I created from a data set, the publicly available data set from the World Bank, which is giving you the coverage rates on social protection policies. We've seen this huge expansion in social protection in the last 15 years in the developing world. The problem is it's not reaching the poorest nearly as well as we would like. It's some variance. So here I've given you coverage rates for the population as a whole and coverage for the poorest quintile, plotted against GDP per capita. We see a rising trend. In other words, it's a kind of cruel irony. Poorer countries are less effective at reaching their poor through covering their poor through this class of policies. It tends to improve as countries develop. So OECD countries do quite well here. I mean, they could do better, obviously, but in the developing world, it's a much more sorry picture. But also we see a variance in the developing world. There's some countries doing much better than others. Bottom line, if you go to the next slide, and bottom line is we've got about roughly 1 billion people living in poverty, depending on your poverty line, somewhere between 800, 1.5. Let's call it 1 billion people living in poverty. We've now got, as a result of this huge expansion in social protection, we've got 1 billion people receiving some form of help. The problem is it's 2 different billions by and large. they're not intersecting much. That's what the picture I just showed you is suggesting an average. Some countries more than others. As how to change that. As countries develop, and the next slide, intersection increases. Moving on to the next slide. No, one more time.
Martin, we will
one
really
more.
need to conclude
Yeah,
afterwards, okay?
That's good. That's good. Right? No, sorry, the one before. Sorry, yeah, that's the one I wanted to. They look similar, but that as countries spend more on social protection, you start to see better efficacy in reaching the poorest. Here I've given you my estimate of the consumption floor post-transfers against mean spending, and that's kind of good news. Although the variance in performance is largely due to levels of spending, it's not due to the efficacy of that spending. Efficacy is where we need to see some considerable improvements. If you go to the next slide, richer countries do tend to see more as countries develop. You start to see a higher floor, and that's also good news. So both of these things you can develop as an economy develops. Its social spending tends to work better at reaching more people, and efficacy starts to improve a bit. But it needs to be kind of a relatively high income before we see substantial improvements. Okay, slides, because running out of time. No, back.
Sorry.
Just yeah, go
really
back before.
Need to conclude. So I don't know if we could just skip to the conclusion slide. If you don't mind.
Okay, skip to the conclusions.
Let's see.
I think we started minutes late.
There it is.
All right. Oh, okay. These are just my 6 recommendations for doing this job better. And none of these recommendations are a specific magic bullet of policy. It's all about better thinking about policies, some obvious, some not. Tailoring policies to realities of the setting, tapping local information and providing more effective support, focusing on poverty, not finer targeting, and continuing debate and discussion, which I think will continue. The idea of both protecting and promoting to improve those trade-offs, monitoring and evaluating and learning from mistakes. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for the rush.